Welcome back to Insights Now. I'm David Kelly, Chief Global Strategist here at JP Morgan Asset Management. As the world emerged from the pandemic, healthcare companies faced several challenges, including declining COVID-19 related revenues, increased R&D expenses, and rising labour costs, all of which weighed on earnings. Although the sector began to recover from its prolonged earnings slump in 2024, performance struggled. Healthcare stocks rose just 2.6% last year, with performance suffering most after the election. Importantly, however, the healthcare sector is comprised of a range of sub-industries, and performance beneath the surface has diverged. For example, as the sector has addressed the backlog of elective procedures delayed by the pandemic, healthcare facilities and equipment manufacturers have done well, while insurers have struggled. When looking for exposure to growth themes driving markets, investors often overlook healthcare in favour of other sectors. That being said, whether it be GLP-1 drug development or AI-powered customized therapies, the reality is that the sector is at the epicenter of transformative change. Looking ahead, healthcare earnings are set to improve in 2025. However, policy actions taken by the incoming administration could meaningfully alter the sector's landscape. On this episode of Insights Now, my new co-host, Gabriela Santos, will be joined by Holly Morris, an equity research analyst covering the healthcare sector and a portfolio manager here at JP Morgan Asset Management, to discuss what Holly is seeing across healthcare. Now let's get started. Over to you, Gabriela.
Thank you so much, David. Welcome, Holly.
Thank you.
If you could give us a little bit of a background about yourself. How did you end up being an equity research analyst and specifically one focused on healthcare?
Well, thank you again for having me. I've always been a science nerd since I was a little kid. I've also been really interested in business. I had lots of little businesses as a kid, making friendship bracelets and
Before Taylor Swift.
Before Taylor Swift, and then I had babysitters clubs, and so I had these two interests that I'd always had. I thought I was going to become a doctor. I went to Johns Hopkins. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in psychological and brain sciences, which is essentially neuroscience. I did research, animal research / lab research there. I did research at the medical school on humans using functional MRI. So I was very deep on that path. I was pre-med. I have a minor in biostatistics. So that was the pathway that I was going down. And as I thought more about it, I just couldn't get that business angle out of my head. But I really didn't know how to kind of take advantage of both science and business. I also was afraid that I may be bored as a doctor. I just thought maybe seeing the same cases or same types of cases day in and day out, maybe over time would not be so fulfilling for me. I'm really intellectually curious. I love new information. So I had some great mentors at Johns Hopkins that saw this, all this conundrum that I was going through, and they said, "Hey, Holly, have you ever thought about doing investment banking?" Mm-hmm. I think investment banking is this kind of like from scientists, that's what they think Wall Street is. Mm-hmm. And I started networking, and I started looking into what is investment banking, what is patent law. I even looked at healthcare patent law a bit, but I just serendipitously had met someone who worked at UBS here in New York City, and he was looking for an entry-level, very junior person to come in with a science background to talk to his clients about drug development. And so specifically in neuroscience. So that was back, I was back in the 2000s. So that was like a really hot area. And so that's, given my background, that it was a perfect match. I knew nothing about stocks. I just talked to clients about science, clinical trials, statistics. And from there, I learned what a stock was. I learned about investing. I went and worked for 5 years at a healthcare-focused hedge fund. I was a global all-cap biopharmaceutical analyst there. Learned a ton. That's where I learned how to invest and how to trade and how to think about sentiment. And then in 2012, I joined JP Morgan Asset Management, where I am a healthcare analyst and a co-portfolio manager.
Amazing intersection. And have you seen commonalities between medical research and investment equity research?
It's a great question. I think the answer is yes, there are commonalities. Commonalities I can think of would definitely be that both biology and the market are inherently very noisy, very complex data sets that we're operating under. So that's a commonality. I think that in both cases, another commonality would be that you are creating a hypothesis, to sort of predict an outcome. This is what I think is going to happen. And then you try to find data to confirm or deny your hypothesis. In biology, that would be through running experiments. More traditionally, in market research or portfolio management, it's about, taking all of these data that we're being inundated with and trying to piece it together, say this supports or denies my hypothesis. Those are commonalities. There are also big differences. And I think that the amount of information that you need to make a decision is a big difference. One thing in biology is that it's an iterative process, and it's running experiment after experiment after experiment. And so it's accumulating tons of data. In the market, the way that our team at least thinks about it is that there's such thing as information overload. And one really cool thing that we think about is from a study in 1973 that was looking at professional horse gamblers. And they were asked to make a series of bets on all kinds of races. And they were asked, what 5 data points would you need to predict the outcome of these races? You only get 5. So they came back, said, these are the 5. Everyone had different 5s, but then they got those pieces of information and they made predictions on the outcomes. They were then told that they could get 10 pieces of data, then 15, then 20, 30, up to 40 pieces of data. And after each incremental data set, they were allowed to rebet. And what was so interesting is that even with all of that additional multitudes more data sets that they actually had no better accuracy than they had with the first 5. But what they did have was much more confidence. And that's something we are really very focused on in particular, is like velocity of decision making, having the accuracy be where we want it to be, but making that speedy decision, and then not spending all of our time going after those additional data points. We're just going to get overconfident in our views and set in our views. We want to keep a flexible mindset. And so the lesson there, I think, is just that that's a big difference, I think, between biology and between market research.
You have to find that sweet spot.
Finding those we narrow it down to 3 to 5 variables, critical variables. If I understand these 3 to 5 critical variables for this stock or this subsector of names, that's where I put all my work and focus. And I really just don't spend so much time on the other 70-80% of information that's coming at me or chasing after that.
And how do you do that in a day? What's a typical day for you then?
Yeah, so that's hard to answer. One of the fun, exciting, crazy parts of this job is that there is no typical day. I wake up really early. The first thing I do is roll over and I'm going through the news looking. So it's a 24/7 job. There's news all the time. We live in a world that's constantly changing, constantly evolving. So I read what's happened overnight, U.S., global, not just healthcare, everywhere, every sector, see what could impact my sector. I look at what's going on in small mid-cap healthcare, really very relevant. So I go through the news, kind of see what's going on, get a lay of the land. I have 3 little kids, so, I get them up and I try to get them as ready as I can before I have to fly out the door. But I also spend a lot of time outside the office, so that's a really big benefit of working at JP Morgan Asset Management, is that we have great relationships with our management teams of our companies. And so I spend a lot of time going out, visiting my companies at their headquarters, or going and visiting their manufacturing plants or seeing their labs, getting a sense of their culture, speaking with their scientists, meeting C-suite executives, not just the CEO or CFO, but really integrating myself into just what is this company all about? One of my favorite parts of the job, and something that I spend a fair amount of time doing. I also am going to medical conferences, all kinds of medical conferences, all different therapeutic areas, speaking to key opinion leaders there, seeing the latest clinical trial data, hearing about the latest innovations. I go to industry events. I speak on a lot of panels, whether it's at medical conferences, at industry events. An important thing I also do is go down to Washington, D.C. quite frequently, keeping a pulse on what's going on politically that could impact healthcare. And then lastly, also a very fun part of my job is as a co-portfolio manager is I meet with clients and I meet with prospective clients to talk about our strategy, but also to talk about healthcare. And so those conversations are really fun for me.
And how do you break down the healthcare sector to those that aren't in the mix? Kind of bite-sized, plain English ways of understanding the different types.
So I'll start with my baby, where I grew up and where I started, which is biopharmaceuticals. So that's biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, mesh them together, biopharma. These are the companies that discover and manufacture new drugs, new therapies to treat and prevent diseases. You'll have medical device and diagnostics companies. So these are the companies that create devices or lab tests to also treat, prevent, or diagnose new diseases. From there, you have the life science tools companies. These are the companies that are enabling all of this R&D, all of this research and development, whether starting as from the very basic lab experiments that you're doing, providing the lab equipment, providing the measurement tools for those experiments, helping with clinical trial management and interpretation of data and trial enrollment. They also are really critical in the manufacturing process of making drugs and the quality of the drugs being to the standard that we require here in the United States by the FDA. So that's a really important subsector as well. Moving over towards services, you have to think about how do we get all of these great new drugs and devices to the consumer. And the consumer could be me and you, or it could be a hospital or a clinic or pharmacy. And those would be the distributors, drug and medical device distributors. So they are taking those products and delivering them to the end customer. In services, we also have managed care. I think everyone's very familiar with what an insurance company is. Hospitals, also people are very familiar with hospitals, but that's another industry I cover. Retail pharmacies, people are familiar with that. I don't think it needs much explanation, but that's a big area. And then I also cover animal health, which is fun.
That was the best explanation I've heard. To me, with a non-medical background and experience, it's the hardest sector sometimes to wrap your head around.
Yeah, these subsectors can act very mutually exclusively. You'd like to think there's this healthcare ecosystem, and in some ways there are, but they can be very idiosyncratic as well.
Speaking of the first type, new drug discoveries, you cannot watch anything on television, if people still have cable, without seeing ads for different GLP-1 drugs. They're absolutely everywhere. So how are you thinking about that innovation within all different subsectors within healthcare?
Yeah, GLP-1 drugs and the pipeline of newer agents that are coming it's just going to be the topic du jour in healthcare for a long time. I think this is one of the most interesting innovations that we've seen in healthcare. We have lots of history here. I mean, these drugs were first sold in 2005 by a company called Amylin for diabetics. We've come a long way in getting the approvals for weight loss. And now we're seeing just tremendous data, absolutely phenomenal data in reductions in cardiovascular events, reductions in hospitalizations, reductions in mortality. So mortality benefits, we're seeing impacts for kidney disease, for liver disease, for sleep apnea. So these are all things that we're seeing right now. I think that there's going to be a plethora of benefits of these drugs. I'm really excited about data that they're collecting in orthopedics, data in pain, data in rheumatoid arthritis and other inflammatory conditions, data on mood disorders, data in Alzheimer's. They're looking at reduced cancer rates. I think that is something that's really fascinating, and we're already seeing some evidence of a reduction in cancer rates. And then overall, an improvement in longevity. This will take time, but these are all things that I'm really excited about. I actually wrote a white paper about a year ago. I co-authored it with my colleague on the large cap growth team, Janet King. She covers consumer for us. So we co-authored this paper, and I encourage you to read it. It goes a little more in depth than I can on this podcast, but it's just talking about GLP-1s, a little bit about the science, a little bit about the clinical data to date back then. That was a year ago, but also just how I was thinking about the impact to the broader healthcare ecosystem. And she's pining on the broader sectors outside of healthcare and what the impacts could be. I mean, right now we really need to focus on getting these drugs to the right patients. We need to focus on doing it in a cost-efficient manner. That's a big focus. And then also keeping patients on these drugs. That's going to be critical to getting these wonderful outcomes. And if we're able to do that, I really do think we're going to see a large reduction in healthcare utilization. We're going to see less hospitalizations. And this is all really important given the ballooning healthcare costs that our country's facing. So I think this is just topic number 1, 2, and 3 as a healthcare investor.
It's truly incredible as you're laying out all of these different solutions maybe that these drugs could help get to. It's incredible. It's beyond just, people taking it to lose some weight.
Yes, absolutely. And there'll be winners and losers. I mean, we keep, I've said this several times, we keep a very open mind. We're very flexible in our thinking. I'm not set in any one data set can totally change how I think about an area, but I do think there are winners and losers now. Those winners and losers may be very different in 5 years, and they may be very different in 10 years. So we keep a really open mind about who will be the winners, who will be the losers within the healthcare ecosystem.
And speaking of another equally exciting, evolving theme, artificial intelligence. And often healthcare is a sector that comes up as potentially a key beneficiary of AI and related innovation. So how do you see companies using it today, maybe 3 years from now, 5, 10? How can we think about that in your space?
Well, I definitely agree healthcare is a prime target for AI to be deployed. I think anything where you have huge data sets, right, is like a prime target. And in healthcare, we have enormous data sets. Additionally, healthcare is very inefficient. So there's huge efficiency gains that I'm looking forward to if and when AI is deployed. However, there are a lot of burdens. There are a lot of barriers in healthcare. And I sometimes think technology companies are a little naive to what these barriers are. Like healthcare is very, very regulated. So that is a huge barrier. We have HIPAA privacy laws around a lot of this data. That is something that's a barrier to accessing the data and utilizing it. Another barrier, I think, would be the lack of interoperability between these data sets. So these data sets sit in all kinds of places, and you probably are very familiar with it, going to your doctor's. You have a doctor here, and he's using this EMR, electronic medical record system. You have a doctor here using a different one. I mean, I even have doctors that are still writing.
Me too.
By files by hand. And so the data's sitting in different formats, and it's not interoperable. So that is a barrier. That being said, I think that these are barriers that can be overcome. I think they'll take time. One area right now where there's probably 2 areas where I am seeing AI being deployed. It's early, but it would be drug discovery. So that's a really long, expensive, high-risk process. And so creating potentially efficiencies in discovering new drugs and developing new drugs. There are several companies that have built business models around this. And then, of course, my legacy companies are all trying to integrate this into their R&D. That's one area. Surgical robotics is another area. They've been using machine learning for a long time. So the advances in computing in the last few years have definitely led to the ability to use machine learning, artificial intelligence, large language models in the area of surgical robotics. So that's something I'm watching closely, and that is a more near to midterm opportunity. Tackling administrative burdens, tackling care delivery, I think is just going to take a lot longer. But, is that 5-10 years? Maybe. But that's how I'm thinking about the opportunities of AI in healthcare.
That's interesting. So some has already been used for ages before ChatGPT came on the
Absolutely,
national consciousness.
Yeah.
Some exciting developments more in the medium term. And then let's be a bit patient about those longer term potential upsides.
Yes.
Right? Turning to another point you mentioned about the day in the life and the need to keep the pulse, not just on innovations and what's going on, but DC, regulation, policy.
Yeah.
We were joking earlier that that's always a theme for healthcare.
Yes.
But particularly recently, a change in the administration, a new person in charge of healthcare, different ways of thinking about it. And we ended up seeing quite a recent correction in healthcare valuations.
Yeah.
So how do you actually see policy evolving? And is it a net negative or net positive for healthcare?
Well, I believe healthcare is going to be a bipartisan target for, I don't want to say indefinitely, but that's what my gut is saying. And here's why. We spend 18% of our GDP on healthcare, 16 to 18%, depending on how it's measured exactly. But if you look at nations number 2 and 3 in terms of spend, it would be France and Germany, and they're spending 11 to 12%. And then there's a lot of countries spending way less. Most of these countries have universal health care, too. So we are spending a tremendous amount more. Our healthcare costs and spend are growing faster than the GDP, so that's only going to just accelerate. And the kicker is, the thing that is very hard for me to wrap my head around is when you look at outcomes, we have the worst outcomes. We have the shortest life expectancy of any of these countries. We have the highest mortality rate for treatable and preventable diseases of any of these countries. We have the highest maternal death rate. We have the highest infant mortality rate. We have the highest suicide rate. We have the highest obesity rate by 2x. Okay, compared to all of these other countries that are spending way less than we are. So very simplistically, it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you sit on, you're looking at this and you're saying, there's something not right here. We're not getting a good deal. We're not getting a good return on our spend. And for that reason, I think that, it is going to continue to be a bipartisan target.
We're literally not getting the bang for our buck here with all the spend.
No.
And do you think maybe what changes with administration is just what part of the healthcare ecosystem is focused on to reduce some of that spending?
Well, I think we're seeing some of that right now. There's definitely been a shift of focus, not to say that there's not still a focus on drug pricing, but there's definitely been a shift to looking at the payers and providers. That's something that we're seeing over within this new administration. So there's an evolving focus within the ecosystem, but the entire ecosystem is under a lot of scrutiny.
And speaking of how that ends up impacting the performance of healthcare stocks, we've seen a persistent discount of healthcare to the broader S&P. So is that likely to change, given that your view of it being really a bipartisan focus?
Yeah, I think policy is a major part of that. I think policy is a major reason one major reason we see that this discount. And as I described, I don't think that is going away, and it may even intensify. It's also very difficult to predict or rely on forward earnings for companies within the healthcare sector when you have this political crosshair on you. And every 2 years, there's an election cycle. So it's just you have to be very nimble to be a successful healthcare investor. I think the discount is also things such as drug pricing, overhangs. Again, that is a DC initiative that we've seen with the IRA. But we also have fundamental challenges such as big drugs coming off patent. And there's going to be even more of that. And the process of backfilling those revenues is difficult. It's a lengthy process to develop a new drug. It's expensive and it's high risk. So if you're a generalist, healthcare may not be the first place you go to find, a good defensive idea. I like to say healthcare is, it typically is thought of as a defensive, but I call it an unreliable defensive. And a part of that is just this, it's very complicated. And there's a lot of idiosyncratic noise in the sector. Like we mentioned before, there's just all these different subsectors that have very different business models. And sometimes, it all fits. There's a data point that fits nicely together within the healthcare ecosystem. But more times than not, it doesn't work that way. It can be mutually exclusive, and it can make it very difficult for someone who's not living day to day in the healthcare arena to interpret.
It's not as easy to say it's defensive because recession or not, we spend money on healthcare, buy healthcare.
Yeah.
It seems much more complicated.
And we've just seen it's not been a reliable area, in times that where the market does go more defensive. We have not seen it in totality be a reliable defensive.
In terms of policy, do you think there's any net positive coming from more deregulation under this administration, more scope for M&A, for example, to try to avoid that patent cliff?
Absolutely. We are seeing already some M&A. The JP Morgan Healthcare Conference is in January, the sell-side hosted healthcare conference. That's the place where every company goes to talk to all their, potential acquisition candidates and network. And we are seeing some deals. And yeah, I do think that that's an area where I am hopeful that we will see deregulation that will encourage more M&A, and we certainly need it. It is, just thinking of the pharmaceutical and biotech industry, my colleagues who cover small cap biotech, there's hundreds and hundreds of companies. Even in my large cap universe, there are a lot of companies, and it doesn't really make sense to have all of these sales forces out there and all of these redundant R&D projects going on. And so I do think, and I am hopeful, that we'll see more M&A under this administration.
And Holly, we've been having a tradition of having a bonus question of if listeners want to get to know a little bit more about the healthcare space and follow it a bit more.
Yeah.
What's a podcast or a book or a movie or a report that you'd recommend?
Sure. I am a super traditional person. I'm very old-fashioned. I read. I take notes by hand. I watch TV with closed captioning. So my answer is not going to be a podcast. I read medical journals, and so New England Journal, Lancet. There's industry publications I really love called one BioCentury. Another one is Stat News. I really like those. But those are can be complicated, and I don't know that that's like an entry-level source of information. Yeah. A fun answer that I have would be a book I just read. A friend of mine sent it to me. I had no idea it was about healthcare. It's a fiction book, and so I picked up. It's called Small Rain by an author named Garth Greenwell, and it's a critique of the U.S. healthcare system through the eyes of a man who has an emergent, life-threatening disease. And so he's admitted to the hospital, and it's about his journey from the ER to the ICU to the then down to the regular care floor. It's just such a great book, and it really looks at how complex our healthcare system is, how there are perverse incentives. And it examines also the relationships between a patient and the caregivers, right, at various points, which in this book there's some good ones and there's some bad ones. And I loved the book. I thought it was such a fun read, and I recommend it. I love it.
Thank you. I love that. I'm a traditionalist as well. Love reading.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a good one. Small Rain.
Small Rain by Garth Greenwell.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us,
thank
Holly.
you so much for having me.
So fun.
It was very fun. Thank you.
And thank you so much for listening and watching this latest episode of our Insights Now podcast. This season, we've been focusing on equity research analysts in various subsectors, so make sure to check out our other episodes. Thank you so much.